for those people who haven't met me before, didn't see Keynote yesterday, or don't know who I am one of the co-founders of DNN Corporation, currently the VP of Technology, and I basically oversee the platform development for DNN. I've been working on DNN platform for the last 12 years, so I have a little bit of experience with it. So today what we're going to talk about is data access, and data access as it relates to DNN, and sort of where we're at today and where we plan to go for DNN next. Like, how do we move forward? How do we progress in terms of our data access story, and you know, improve on what we have today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about both sides of where we're at. So with that, let's go ahead. And so really, to talk about data access, it's important that we understand sort of the history. Yes, sir.
May I interrupt you for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
There's two workshops going on that I would like to mention. One is Ernst Peter, in case you don't know, starting at 150, and the other one is Ash with his mobile accelerator thing.
Yes.
Exactly, that's going on the same time. If you want to go to those workshops, go to Ernst Peter, talk to him, or Ash directly. Okay?
I'm going to take a part of the lunch, but the lunch is 2 hours. That's long enough for most people. So you won't miss any, because we're going to take 45 minutes between 1:15 and 2 o'clock at the chalet number 121, if you want to learn something about it. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay, so when we talk about data access, really it's helpful to sort of understand where we started at, so that you can understand sort of the progression of how we've been evolving over the last 10 years. So sort of in the beginning, if you go back and you look at the DNN1 code base, and this is actual code from, you can see it's VB. It may be strange to some people in the room. To others of us, it's like mother's milk, but this is sort of where we started, right? Everything we did, you started with a connection, you created a command object, you added SQL parameters, and you did all of this very low-level, basic ADO access, right? And it was very tedious, and every method you called had this exact same pattern in it. And what happened quite frequently, more frequently than anyone would like to admit, is that somebody somewhere in their code would forget to close a record set or close a data set, and you would end up with like all of these open connections to your database, and eventually everything would crash because there was no more ability to get to the database, right? And so while there were some good things about DNN1, this was not one of them. So we very quickly evolved beyond that, and by quickly I mean it took us a year and a half. We moved to data access layer in DNN2, and the data access layer really consisted of the whole SQL provider model, and the SQL provider model basically came out in DNN2, which came out at the same time as I want to say Visual Studio 2003, or right after that it was ASP.NET 1.1, post 1.1 prior to 2. But it's basically in that time frame, right? And the whole point of this was to say, hey, wait a minute, you're not responsible for the SQL command object anymore. We're going to bury that. We're going to abstract that under the covers. All you have to do is write to this API, and we'll provide the rest for you. So you had all these commands, all of these things in the data provider. And the challenge with this was that we took away some things from you. What we didn't do is you still had to define the database, you still had to define a bunch of stored procedures, then you defined an abstract class, then you defined a concrete class on top of the abstract class, and then you defined a controller that called the concrete class, that called the abstract class, that called the database, right? Very easy stuff. Everyone understood it completely. and everyone loved writing all of these abstract classes, concrete classes, so that we could write to both SQL Server and Access databases, because we were cross-platform. So we, and there was a MySQL data provider at the time, and an Oracle data provider. But the reality was that none of the modules that existed actually leveraged the cross-database capability of the data provider. So we had this great architected concept that was very complicated to use and that didn't actually solve the problem that it set out to solve, which was to allow us to connect to multiple databases. So we just were left with the complicated part. So we improved on that. So in maybe about 2005, we added this thing called the Dowel Plus. And the Dowel Plus basically said, well, instead of doing all this low-level stuff to set up commands or maybe a little more abstracted stuff to access the database, instead, why don't we give you some generic methods, execute query, execute non-query, execute reader, scalar, execute SQL, and you could just use those to make database access, right? You didn't have to do as much of the more complicated, and I'll show you examples of all of this in DNN here in a bit. But you could use this Dowel Plus, and it was much easier, and you could actually inline SQL using Dowel Plus. You didn't have to create a stored procedure necessarily on the server, although if you did it inline, you potentially open yourself up to SQL injection attacks. So we said, even though you can do it inline, don't do it inline because it's very bad to do that. So again, great in theory, great concept, but it's like we took away the benefit we were going to give you and still left you with the complicated thing, right? Because you still had to write your scripts for the database. You still had to write, in some cases, an abstract class, concrete class, controller sitting on top of all of that. And it was still just a little too complicated, right? There was still a lot of moving parts. Creating data access for most modules and even for the core platform was very cumbersome, very tedious. A little better than where we were before because you really only had three or four methods that you had to deal with, but still more complicated than what we needed to. So after that, we said, well, what can we do? How can we leverage some things that were going on? And back about 2011, I guess, 2010-ish, right? 2011, I think.
Yeah, it was
maybe.
DNN 7.1.
Yeah. So we implemented Apoco. And Apoco is basically a micro ORM. And Apoco basically says you don't have to worry about how to access the database. You tell me what the database looks like, i.e. define an entity, define a class with some properties on it, maybe throw some attributes on those properties so I know what the primary key is, so I know what table this class relates to in the database. And if you do those things, then we will create a repository for you, and we will do your CRUD methods, your add, update, delete, inserts, get finders, find by ID, find by whatever, and we'll implement all of those for you in some base classes, and then all you really have to do is the logic on how to new up an instance of an object that you're going to insert, or how do you get the ID and give it to the find method so that you get the object back. But the actual moving of an entity from your class into the database, or from the database instantiated into a class, all of that was taken care of for you, right? So it's very, very simple. And it's a micro ORM, meaning it does the basics, the very basics of what a normal ORM would do. And an ORM, for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, is an object relational mapper, right? You have database tables that look something like the classes that you need to use in your code, your data classes. and how do you map data from your database into your classes and vice versa, and how do you maintain relationships and transit those relationships and apply the data changes back to the database. And a micro ORM just really focuses on, says, I'm going to take your data model and I'm going to basically map it one-to-one to a class model in your application, which is nice if that's the way you want to model your application. Not so nice if your application doesn't model that cleanly to the underlying data structures, right? So if you want some more complicated structures, this doesn't necessarily equate very well, right? Because you can't do the mappings the way you normally would with a full ORM. So getting better, and we'll actually, let's dive into code here and kind of take a look at some of this so we can actually see this from a working perspective. Because I think once you see this and see what you can do today, then when we start talking about sort of where we're going or what the world looks like after DNN 8, then I think some of this will make more sense. Where's my Visual Studio? There we go. Okay. My mouse won't work. There we go. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, so we're going to start with, we're going to start with the dynamic content system, right? So I know the dynamic content system, if you go look at it today, it's written in using Apoco. So it's using the Dowel 2 and all of the stuff that we talk about in the Dowel 2. And so you can see I have this data type. So a data type, if you saw the demo yesterday, a data type is just, actually let me pull that up. I thought I had the browser open, but apparently I don't. So a data type just says, I have this thing and it's a URL and we're going to store it in the database as a string. And so as we're defining content types in the system, then I know how to do that mapping. If someone gives me a URL, I know that ultimately I'm going to store it somewhere as a string. And that's all I really care about. So we'll wait for that to come back up. Oh, there we go. All right, so going to the manager. So here you can see I've got my data types. I've got a list of data types, right? So what I want to do is I want to be able to store this now in the database. So that's what this data type class is, right? It's a representation of what I'm seeing there on screen. This says I've got a name, I've got a portal ID, a data type, all of that. So fairly simple. So I got my structure. I know what my data looks like. Now, how would I go about mapping that to the database? Well, we've got these attributes at the top of the screen here, right, that says here's my table name, here's my primary key. I can make it cacheable, or I can set a certain scope, lifetime or does this scope down to the portal? Does it scope to a particular module, or is it not scoped at all, right? So all of those things I can sort of define on my data type, and then to actually use it, I would come in here into my data manager. So this is a class like our old controller classes, that the purpose of this thing is just to manage what's going on, data access, so push data down into the database or retrieve it back. So here we've got an example of a simple CRUD method, which is to add one of these data type entities into my database, right? So I'm just doing some simple checks to make sure that I've got a data type name, which is a required field, and then I set up my data type, and this is it. This here is the whole part of your data access layer. I just call the add method. And the reason I can do that, and what that add method, where that add method lives, is in this controller base class. So controller base is a core system class, right? So if you go into the DNN library, down here under our data
I should point out,
folder.
Joe, that I added that class in DNN 8.
Yeah.
It was a little bit more work prior to
Yeah.
DNN 8, but this
Yeah.
is new in DNN 8.
So you have this controller base class that defines what these underlying methods are. So prior to, and Charles is right, prior to 8, you had to actually do the data context, get repository or add repository, right? You had to manipulate the repositories, but effectively, even then, the lines of code is still pretty minimal, right? You get a repository and then you do some action on the repository. So Charles has abstracted that out even further for 8, but effectively this is still what you have available today in the Dowel 2 that you can use.
I got fed up writing that same boilerplate.
Yeah, see, and you notice a pattern as we've been going along, right? We started with a bunch of boilerplate that we had to write with SQL commands and parameters and connection strings. And we've been slowly but surely identifying areas where there's boilerplate code in our data access layer and getting rid of it. Or identifying where there's lots of friction, i.e. I have to create a stored procedure, then I have to create a item in an abstract class, then I have to create a concrete implementation of that abstract class, right? And so there's a lot of this ceremony that we were doing around data access. And so we want to get rid of that as much as possible. And I think in DNN 8, even in DNN 7, we effectively have done that for the most part. And if you go and look, even today, if you go and look at the data provider that exists for DNN, and this is DNN 8 code, so this is definitely, and if you go and look at data provider methods for the most part, let's, yeah, I'm not down. Did I miss something here? SQL data provider, is that, and am I not looking at the right class?
You probably got collapsed in the region. But it does have the execute scalar, execute.
Yeah, I'm still, this is not the one I wanted to see. But anyway, so in this case, the execute scalar, execute reader, everything ultimately still goes back through Apoco. So even though you might be using the old Dowel Plus methods, under the covers, everything is still going back through Apoco. So if you think you're avoiding Apoco today, you're wrong. Apoco is everywhere. All of our data access uses it. We may fool you by giving you the old API calls, but ultimately everything is going to go back through Apoco. And you can see that here in this SQL data provider, right? So when you actually come down to, and now I don't know where the other SQL data provider moved to, because it's not this one. This is, oh, it is this one. This is the one I was looking for. Yeah. So if you look at the methods here in the data provider class, what you ultimately see is everything is an execute non-query, right? So this is the Dowel Plus method of calling the database, and then under the covers we've changed Dowel Plus to be Dowel 2 Apoco.
7.1 removed all of the
Yeah.
original Dowel, went to Dowel Plus and everything.
Yeah. So whether you wanted to use Dowel 2 or not, you actually are using Dowel 2, which is good, right? Because we've removed a lot of the ceremony. So if you go directly to the Dowel 2 approach, then you're kind of ahead of the game. If you're doing Dowel Plus, you have some of the ceremony still there, but under the covers we're getting rid of that. Okay, so that's the nice thing. You don't have to have your concrete implementation or your abstract implementations anymore. You can really just inherit from that controller base and take advantage of Dowel 2, which is awesome. And so to effectively use the data access layer today, it generally looks like you define your entity, you define your class, you define the database, or vice versa, you define the database table that you want to access, right? And then you can create a controller that inherits from controller base, And that's the whole process for setting up data access layer in DNN as it exists or will exist here in the next couple of months. Okay? So that's where we're at. That's sort of our starting point for data access. And there are some good things and bad things about this approach to data access. So if we look at on the positive side, that we have this very lightweight framework now, right? Micro ORMs are about lightweight data access. It's very simple entity-based repositories, and by that I mean you have a one-for-one mapping table to entity, and that you can somewhat define how that entity looks, but beyond that it's a very simple mapping. And you do in fact have raw database access where you need it. So if you really need a stored procedure, for example, to do some complex manipulation of data in the database, or for performance reasons because you want to do joins over multiple tables, or for any number of reasons, if you need that raw access, you can get it through Dowel 2. You can call execute SQL, and it will pass that SQL all the way down through the Apoco layer, all the way down to the database, make your call. It can be either stored inline SQL, or it could actually be just a stored procedure call, right? So we can handle both of those scenarios. The bad side to Dowel 2 and to the Apoco approach as it exists today, and really almost every micro ORM that's out there today, is that most of them are dead projects. So whether you're talking about Subsonic or Massive DB or Apoco, and there's half a dozen others, most of them are one-person projects that they started, they were interested in them, they iterated on them for 6 months, a year, year and a half, and then they effectively said, it does everything I need it to do, I'm done with it, and they moved on, right? We have now this dependency in the framework on Apoco, but the developer is no longer developing, enhancing, maintaining, doing anything with that code. So now it's incumbent on us. If we have a performance issue in Apoco, we have to fix it. If there's some other enhancement we want to do to Apoco, we have to fix it. And by we, I mean DNN Corp or someone in the community. Somebody somewhere in this room probably is going to be making changes to that code going forward. There is limited support for complex mapping, and by limited I mean almost none. And there are cases where you want complex mapping, right? I want to be able to have an entity that refers to another entity and that you can set up relations with, or that I can have an entity that actually is decomposed under the covers into two tables in the system, right? And now I might be able to get away with that by doing something with views and layering on a view under the covers to do that decomposition for me. But the reality is complex mappings are really not what micro ORMs are about, right? They're really about very simple mappings. So if you have more complicated stuff, then this doesn't work well for you. And the last one becomes more critical as we talk about how we're moving forward with the platform, and that is that Apoco is not supported in the core CLR. Remember that part in number 1 about being a dead project. So for number 3, just refer to number 1 and you'll understand why. But this becomes important for us because I don't want to rewrite the thing myself. I don't want to have ownership of this ORM because if we have to build everything ourselves and maintain everything ourselves, we're going to be in the ORM business, not in the DNN platform business, right? And what we found over the last 10 years is we've ended up being in the, we're now a rich text editor we're now in that space, and we're in this space, and we're maintaining code for all of these different pieces that I would really just like to consume as a consumer of that component rather than being a maintainer of that component, if you understand the difference. So our vision for DNN going forward is that we compose DNN out of many different components that are available in the open source ecosystem, the ORM or the micro ORM just being one of those. Okay, so that's sort of where we're at today and some of the challenges we have with where we're at. So how do we move forward? What do we want in sort of the next data access layer? What are the things that we're looking for? Well, we want to keep the good things from what we have today, right? We want something that's very lightweight. I don't want to have this super heavyweight, add another 30 megs to my project because I took a dependency on something. I want it to be very fast and efficient. I want it to be simple when I need it to be simple. For the bulk of our use cases in DNN today, it's simple CRUDs, single entity mapped to a single table, that's fine. But I also want, when I have more complex requirements, that the data access solution scales to those more complex requirements, right? Raw access, I still need, for performance reasons, to have the ability to write a stored procedure and to call that stored procedure, and even in some cases to write raw inline SQL where it's needed. Now on the bottom three, these are sort of new things that we're adding in. This is stuff that we don't have today and that we want. And one of those is, obviously, we want to be able to support Core CLR on ASP.NET 5. And the reason that we want Core CLR support is, one, because Core CLR gives us a very lightweight framework to build on, very fast framework to build on, but it also gives us cross-platform support. And when I talk about cross-platform, I talk about cross-platform in sort of two orthogonal ways, right? Cross-platform being the ability to run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, but also the ability to run on databases that can run on Windows or Linux or Mac OS, right? Which means ultimately I have to be able to either move to a different database that can do that natively, like something like a PostgreSQL, or I have to allow the framework, the data access layer, to target multiple databases. So some people who are on SQL Server today, they don't really have a reason to move off of SQL Server. SQL Server is a great database server. It's served us well for 13 years. And we want to still support that. And that's still going to be our primary development platform moving forward. But SQL Server doesn't run on a Mac OS, and it doesn't run on Linux, right? So if we want to serve those markets, then I need to be able to target databases that also serve those markets. So the data access strategy going forward has to support the Core CLR, has to have an ability to support cross-platform, i.e. move the whole stack, database included, to run on any one of those three operating systems. And then finally, we want whatever data access solution and whatever technology we use under the covers for data access to have good support from the developers of that technology, right? So if we go with an ORM, I want the ORM vendor to be supporting that ORM, not DNN Corp to de facto take over ownership of this ORM. So sort of with those requirements in place, and we've had numerous discussions with a lot of people about what they want. I know some people, Peter Donker's one, he really wants close to the metal, as close to the database as he can get, access. Other people are like, that's way too low level for me. I'm fine to hand it off and give someone else responsibility for translating to and from the database. I just want my data, right? And so as a result of that, we looked at what options were available, and we are going to go with Entity Framework 7 for ASP.NET. And that's probably, everyone in the room is like, well, that's so obvious. You know, we could have started with that slide. But if you knew how many conversations we had, and so this goes back to the slides I was showing yesterday in the keynote about different people being at different paths or different points in the cycle, right? Some people are like, oh, Entity Framework 7, of course, that makes sense, you know, but that's really sort of bleeding edge for a lot of people. And some people are very uncomfortable with that, and that's okay. But for DNN NEXT, if you're going to embrace the idea of a DNN NEXT, then you have to be ready to embrace the idea of new technology. So Entity Framework 7 just makes sense in this context. And the nice thing is that Entity Framework 7 is open source. So it is built and maintained by Microsoft, so I think it's not going away anytime soon. And because it's open source, we can actually contribute back as we see issues or see problems, submit a pull request, and they'll incorporate it as appropriate or not. You know, but I think Entity Framework is a good choice for the community, and so that's effectively what we're moving forward with. So what does that look like in terms of knowing the steps or knowing what we have to do with Dowel 2 today to access the database? What does it look like in the Entity Framework world? What do we get with that, and how does that look? Now, we're going to talk in the abstract here because we don't have, like, I would show you all of the code, data access code that we have for DNN NEXT, but it would be a very short session if we did that, since there is no lines of code having been written yet. But anyway, so the process is very much like we have with Data Access Layer 2, right? You create a class, whether it's a blog or an announcements or whatever it is. You inherit and you get this DBContext, and actually if you look back over and I didn't show this part, if you look back over here into the DNN side, you'll actually see there is this data context thing that we have. So we actually have this concept of a data context or a DB context in DNN today, and the same thing is true in Entity Framework and Entity Framework 7. So you have this DB context that you inherit from, and you say, in this DB context, I have these database sets or these database tables effectively that I need to access. And then ultimately you register with the provider how you're going to connect up to the database. And so let's go ahead and step through this and see exactly what this looks like for Entity Framework 7. Now this is all new code, so we're gonna start from file new project here, and so this is file new project, and so we're gonna do this on the fly. I've actually run through this a bunch of times earlier, so in theory it should work, but in practice, as Ernst Peter can attest, practice does not always equal theory. So this is, if you go into Visual Studio 2015 today and do file new ASP.NET, you know, give me a ASP.NET 5 project, this is what you'll get out of the box, right? So it's like, maybe what I want to do, and in my example, I think what I want to do is I want to take these slider images and rather than having them hard-coded, I want to actually pull them out of the database. And we'll see how far we can get in the time we've got left. We'll at least cover the concepts. We may actually get to running code if I don't screw up something in the process. But we'll understand the concepts regardless of whether I screw it up or not. So the first thing we need to do, let's go ahead and stop this, is let's go ahead and come into my controllers here, or actually into my models. So remember we said first thing we have to do is we have to create this base entity. What is it that I want to store? So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new model here. So we'll just create a new class, and we'll call this, I'm going to call this my banner view model. Right, so I'm going to create my base entity, and I'm actually going to have a separate banner entity in here. And we're going to call it banner. And I just need this raw entity for what does a single record look like. And a single record in my world looks like I'm going to have a, and so rather than this, what I want to do, just bear with me for a second. Where's my file explorer? There we go. So I actually cheated a little bit. If I can find my, oops. Here we go. We'll just copy and paste out of here. Much easier. So we're just going to grab this banner definition here, and we'll drop it in. Okay, so I've got an entity, I've got a view model, and in my view model, all I care about is having an IEnumerable of banner, and that's banners, and we're good. Not quite. Yeah, we're good. So everything's there, right? So this is my entity now. I know what my database should look like. So now what's the second thing that we said we had to do over here in our model, right? So we created the class. We've got to have this thing called DBContext. So in the default project, they actually have application context because they use entity framework for some other stuff. So we're just going to leverage that in the moment. And so I've got this application DBContext, and I'm just going to add my DB set to this. And I'm going to define that as type banner, and that is good. So I've got this DB set that allows me to get my banners back from the database. So this is basically setting up that repository that if you've used Dowel 2 and DNN, this is now our repository, if you will, for banners in entity framework, right? So the next item that we said we had to do is we had to declare the entity in the DBContext, which we've done, and now we have to go and register the provider, use SQL Server, and set up the connection string in our system. And so in ASP.NET 5, those connection strings by default live in this config JSON. I've already got one set up in here. It lives under data default connection string. And then if we look in our startup.cs, we're going to see buried down here a little bit, and we'll give some space here to just sort of clear this out, and I'll zoom in so people can sort of see what we're doing here. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Don't do that. F11 works in the browser. It does not work the way you expect in the, I think it's Alt-Enter maybe. No, that's still not what I want. Come on. Okay, we'll just drag it out here. So anyway, you can, this is the code, right? So we add entity framework into our services configuration. tell it we're going to use SQL Server. So Entity Framework is another piece that we're using, Entity Framework's fine. And then we set that context. So in this case, it's the application DBContext, and we tell that application DBContext use SQL Server and use the connection string that's stored there, right? So we've effectively done all of those steps. So at this point, we should be good to go. We should have our entity set up. We've got our DBContext is set up, and everything's wired up, and we should be ready to go, right? So I should just be able to run this, and it would work, or at least it would access the database. I haven't done it. I haven't made any database calls yet, right? I haven't actually started using my data access layer, but the data access layer is fundamentally there. So one of the things that Entity Framework gives us that we don't have today, right? So like there's one more piece that we would do in DNN if we were in DNN today is we still have to, I still haven't done anything about where is the definition of this, of the database table, right? How does the database table get created? And if you think about it in DNN, the way it gets created is we go out and we write a SQL data provider script, right, that gets executed on install, or we can manually execute it. And we can use that same approach here. I could go and create through a script or just by going out to the database, and I could create that table and everything would work and be just fine. But the other thing that we can do in Entity Framework is take advantage of something called migrations. So migrations are effectively, if I've defined my model, my entities in my code, and I've told the system I have this DB context, and in my DB context I have a DB set for record set for an entity, then Entity Framework can actually reason about the code and figure out what does the database need to look like in order to support that code. And then it can script up a bunch of commands that will then go out and modify the database to end up looking just like that. And so in this case, out of the box, there is in fact a migration that was already done for the identity management system in there. And so what you see is that there's this migration script, and it goes through and it creates a table called ASP.NET Users, tells you all the columns and constraints and everything else, and that's all nice. And so this is one that already will exist when you create your file new project, assuming you set it up with the default identities and stuff. But we need to create our own. So if we go and look in the project JSON file, and so you're going to get familiar, and you probably, if you've been looking at Elon's sessions last couple of days, have seen him go in here a couple of times to add references and do some different things. The one area I want to focus on is this command section here. And you've got the web command, which everyone should have seen before. But you've also got this command called EF. And what this is this is the Entity Framework command line function. So you can actually use this command to manipulate the database through Entity Framework for this project. So I'm going to actually drop out here to PowerShell. And I'm going to use some EF commands. So you can see here I've been playing with it a little bit already. And so if I just open my shell, the very first thing I would do is I would do a DNBM, which is the version manager for DNX, and you might do a DNVM list so you can see what's installed. And there's this one called default, this default alias way over here. And so what I want to do is the first time I come in here is I would do a DNVM use default. If I didn't have aliases set up, then I'd have to give the big long version name I'd have to say 1.0.0.beta 4, tell it what runtime and what architecture I wanted, all of that. But since we've got an alias, I can just say DNBM use default, and it'll set that on my path variable for this console that I'm running in now. So now that I've got that on my path, I can use DNX, and then DNX dot, I keep hitting X, I'm not sure why. And then I can call my command. So I can use that EF command that was in my project, because I'm in the project folder right now. I'm actually in this directory, so it knows what project to look in to find this EF command. And so let's just do a quick EF help and see what's available there. Right, so I can see what context is available. I can see migrations. So migration looks like it's what I want to do. So let's do a DNX dot EF migrations and see what migrations are currently in the database. So it says that it's got this this create identity schema. So I've got my banner stuff that I just defined, and I want to create a migration that effectively is going to take me from where the database is at to the addition of this new stuff, right? So I can do DNX EF migration at migration add, and we're going to call this banner, and it's going to go out using that same application DBContext, and it's going to create this banner migration for me. So if I come back in here, you're going to see now I have this new migration called banner, and if I open that up and come down in here, you'll see we have this migration that didn't actually pick up my migration. Let me just build and see what's going on. Did I miss something? What's that?
Maybe you have to build first.
Yeah, so we'll go back and try that again. So I'm going to remove that last migration, and we'll get an error. So it doesn't seem to want to remove migrations for me in this version. I've been playing with this all morning, and this looks like it's something that's broken in ASP.NET 5 right now. So we'll just call it banner 2. Let's see if it's actually going to create my migration for me correctly. Yeah, so I'm not sure why. So we should have a migration here, and we don't. Let me go back and just make sure my model is set. Yeah. Banner. Not sure where it's not picking it up. So this is
Beta code.
yeah. So no, because this is just a property name or a field name. It doesn't really matter. It's this is capital, and this is capital. Let me just make sure that it's picking that. Well, it's got to be. There's no other banner here. Announcements. Models. Banner. Yeah, so it is definitely picking it up from the right place. So I'm not sure why it's not coming back and applying the migration. We'll run the code and see if we're going to get it to run correctly. It may not at this point since the migration's not being built correctly. So what should have happened there and what normally happens is that it will create that migration for you, And it works fine in EF6, so I know that it's probably just some bug or something that some step that I skipped here. I don't think I didn't see any steps that I missed, but so when that is working correctly, what you'll end up with is you'll get your banners table will get created automatically for you, and so then it will actually be able to wire the two of those up, and you'll be able to then make your calls against that DBContext. So then if I were going to use this now in my code, and we'll just assume that is created correctly, even though it's not, we know it's not. We'll come down here to our view, and we'll say, maybe on that home page, what I want to do is I'm going to want to be able to pass a view model in here into my home. So now we're talking MVC stuff, right? So now how do I use that DBContext? So this view is being driven off of a specific controller inside of the system, right? Which is this home controller. So I would just come in here into my index, and I would tell it that I want an application DB context, and it's going to say that you need to use DNN. There we go, and we can say that that's DB. And so the system knows, because in ASP.NET 5 we have dependency injection automatically. So when I say this, the system is going to say, oh, I need to give you a DB context, and the system, the application, already knows where the DB context is. It will inject it through here. So I could actually then, at this point, say DB dot, if everything was working correctly, I would be able to say db.banners, which tells me, oh, you know what? You're going to laugh. Or maybe not. But I never declared, and that told me exactly what the problem was. I didn't declare this as public. So by not having that as public, it couldn't see that. So we'll do banners 3. Now that looks like it took a more reasonable amount of time. We'll see if that migration is there. And it didn't take it yet. So, oh, did I not save? I may not have saved. Anyway, but you get the idea, right? I would be able to call db.banners, and I would get back a list of banners, and then we would go ahead and bind that up to our model. Gotcha. Thank you. So at this point, we would basically be done. We would pass that into our view, and then we would start using that data inside of our view. So that is really the direction we're going in terms of data access. And so if you have any questions about data access and sort of the direction we're headed, how to use Entity Framework 7. So there is documentation available on Entity Framework 7 that's coming from Microsoft. So that they have put out some documentation on it, just not a lot yet. So it's starting to build up. So in terms of DNN, the things that we still have to do, right? So we have to define, are we going to use migrations, or are we going to stick with SQL scripts, or are we going to do both, right? Do we want to support both? I personally think migrations have some value for us, but I also know other people who are quite comfortable and want to still continue to use SQL scripts. Right. Right, and I ultimately think that we're going to end up having both options available in the new platform. And then ultimately, I believe that we're going to do some other stuff over the top of Entity Framework that's going to look very similar to the Dowel 2 and the way that looks and operates today, to simplify some of the wire up of the Entity Framework. So that's sort of where we're at and where we're going with data access. If you have any questions, I know we're basically out of time here for this session. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to come see me, come see Charles or Cahal, and pick our brains in terms of what we're talking about for data access for DNN neXt. Thanks all for coming out today, and don't forget to do your evaluations later today.